So every compressive strategy either reorients or changes shape or has some other influence that produces an outcome. Good morning, happy Wednesday. I have Neuro Coffee in hand and it is perfect. All right. We gotta cut to the chase here. It is Wednesday. Got some stuff to discuss first. The Intensive 12 folks are still working hard on their prep work, but I wanted to give you a heads up that probably within the next week or so we'll throw up the applications for the Intensive 13 because those dates have been selected. And I also got word that I got a special guest coming, so I'm pretty excited about that. Somebody I haven't seen in a really, really long time that will be an outstanding participant in the intensive. It's Wednesday. Tomorrow's Thursday, 6 a.m. Coffee and Coaches Conference call. Please join us. The groups have been fabulous. The questions have been outstanding. I'm loving these calls. And you get to see little segments of it, but literally we're doing like 2 hours at a time of Q&A. So it's been terrific. That reminds me, today's Q&A. This comes from, I hope I'm saying this correctly, Las Rashid. And his question is, I'm a bit confused still on what is meant when you talk about compressive strategies. How does it manifest, present itself symptom-wise other than loss of joint range of motion, such as internal rotation or external rotation? If someone's a narrow ISA has posterior lower compressive strategy, does that mean that they would feel tension in those muscles below the trochanter, or does it just manifest itself as a restriction in movement and not cause the tissues themselves to feel tense or painful? So we have talked about each one of these elements before. So here's what I did. I went back into the YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe to the YouTube channel, please. And I pulled off some stuff here. So we got some theoretical stuff in regards to the compression expansion, so you understand why those two strategies are basically the only way that we can move through space. Secondly, I pulled a video in regards to describing what muscle tightness is, which is useful and important. And then I threw up some narrow end game strategies, since you did bring up the narrows with the posterior lower compression. So a nice little review there for you and for all of you. I hope you find it useful. If you have a question, please go to askbillhartman@gmail.com. If you would like a 15-minute consultation, go to askbillhartman@gmail.com and put 15-minute consultation in the subject line so I do not delete it. Everybody have an outstanding Wednesday. I will see you tomorrow morning, Thursday, 6 a.m. Coffee and Coaches Conference call. Have a great day. Everything inside of you is going to be based on compression expansion. So the peristalsis that moves the lunge through your gut is compression expansion. If we look at something local, like muscular contraction, so if a concentrically oriented muscle, there's actually a higher pressure within that muscle. So the intramuscular pressure is higher. As we reduce the concentric orientation, we have a reduction in pressure there as well. So again, we always have compression expansion taking place somewhere at some time. It all depends on where we're looking. We're also going to see this as global strategies. So every movement that you have is going to have some peak moment of force output, which would be representative of the compressive strategy. To what degree is then dependent on what you're doing. You know, if you're drinking a glass of water, it's not going to be your maximum peak force that you could produce, but there is going to be a peak in that moment in time. If I'm doing a vertical jump, it's a little bit easier to see that representation of that peak moment. So every sporting movement is going to have this expansion to compression to expansion representation. If we're talking about a high jump, the moment that the high jumper plants his foot into the ground, there's going to be a peak resultant, and then as he leaves the ground, he's going to re-expand. Sprinter, same thing, hitting the ground, compression to expansion. If I'm throwing a baseball, there's a moment in time where everything squeezes tight, time stops, and I produce this maximum output of force. It's just very, very brief, and so we don't see these things because our eyes just can't stop time to recognize that. But we can see these things, we can measure these things in like force plates, and we can watch it on video and such. So Ryan, everything becomes this compression to expansion to compression. If we look at the universal principles, if you will, we can get really off the deep end here. And we can say that, okay, space-time has a very specific shape that looks like that, and that's called a light cone, because light behaves the same way, time behaves the same way, space, the influence of gravity, etc., all play into this sort of expansion, compression, expansion. If you were theoretically near a black hole, you would probably recognize this shape as well. So again, this is all theoretical physics stuff, which is way above my pay grade. But anyway, it makes this a nice representation when we talk about our external rotation and internal rotation representations of how we move. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to expand that point where I have the meeting of the two cones a little bit, so I can show you where this internal rotation moment is. And now we can start to influence this. So now we're going to go to Andrew's question. So Andrew says, for someone who's looking to optimize performance or hypertrophy, you say that there's often a trade-off that occurs between muscle hypertrophy and general movement capabilities, given the compression that is created with muscle hypertrophy. However, I know you use bilateral squats, and I'm sure other symmetrical exercises in your programs is the advantage of bilateral movements, simply that they're easier to standardize and teach, allowing for quicker learning and more accurate tracking, or am I missing something? Okay. So when we're using bilateral symmetrical activities, which are higher load, higher force capabilities, our goal is to increase that moment in time where we can produce force. And so as we add weight to the bar, as we're using these bigger movements, our goal is to teach ourselves to achieve that element of maximum force output, maximum compression. And as long as we're increasing our force and it doesn't interfere with anything else, then we've got a very, very useful strategy for training here. Now, the byproduct of this, though, is I'm increasing compression, which slows down time. So it increases the duration that I am in this internally rotated force-producing position. And so if by adding my ability to produce force requires that I increase the amount of time that I utilize that, so now I've extended this period where I'm producing force, and I actually slow down, where I actually reduce my velocity where I needed velocity, I've now created interference. And so that's when force production can become detrimental. It just simply interferes with our ability to represent that one moment in time where I have this maximum peak force output that has to occur very briefly. So, if I was a golfer and I extended the duration of the amount of force that I was trying to put out, I actually slow down the club head, because what I want that peak to be recognized at a very, very brief moment in time that allows the highest possible force production. If I have to reduce the field of external rotation that I have available to me, which is representative of the amount of motion that I need to demonstrate ranges of motion or velocity, if I have to compress that to increase my force production, I have now again created an interference. So bilateral symmetrical exercises are well designed to increase my ability to produce a compressive strategy, which allows me to increase my peak forces at the right time. Hypertrophy is a byproduct of that. Hypertrophy by itself, again, to develop any significant amount of hypertrophy, there's going to be some compressive strategies associated, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's interference. So again, the way that we figure this stuff out, Andrew, is that we train people. And so we actually have to do things, and we determine what is the best course of action. And so we have to have some form of key performance indicator that is going to allow us to determine whether we're on the right path or not. So if I'm trying to improve someone's acceleration, so let's say that I'm measuring their acceleration through a 10-meter sprint from a standing start, I take them into the gym, I train them, I bring them back, and I retest that 10-meter sprint. And if that continues to improve, then my strategy in the weight room is good. And so if I'm using bilateral symmetrical activities to do that, great. But at some point in time, and maybe it happens and maybe it doesn't, at some point in time, it can become interference. The only way that you can tell whether this is going to happen is as you train them. And again, this is why we monitor key performance indicators for Friday. So this comes from Jason, and Jason says, it's common sentiment that we hear in the industry that a certain muscle is tight because it's weak, particularly in reference to hamstrings, hip flexors, and shoulder external rotators. How does this concept fit within the orientations and strategies of your model? Well, let's talk a little bit about the concept that you're asking about first and foremost, and let's kind of figure out where that sort of comes from. And I think it's based on what would be the typical structural reductionist model, where people are taking physical properties in the world around us and then trying to apply them to humans. For instance, if you pull on a rope or stretch a leather belt or a rubber band, you feel the tension. And if your model of the world is based on these physical properties and you apply them to humans, then my perceptions are going to follow. And so it's like we compare muscles to tension in rubber bands, even though that's not remotely true. That might be where this kind of thing comes from. Knots in muscles is another one that sort of stands out in my mind. Muscles don't actually have knots in them. They might have contracted areas that become sensitive. But somebody called them knots at some point in time. It kind of caught on. It's a great metaphor. It's very useful for a descriptor to describe a sensation. It's just not much of reality. Doesn't mean we don't feel tension in tissues. So under circumstances of yielding actions, we certainly do feel that, because load is always distributed into the connective tissues, and that's a lot of what we perceive. Based on my model. So whether we have a concentrically oriented muscle or an eccentrically oriented muscle, and we get to some end of excursion that is allowed under those circumstances, and we do have the yielding action, that's definitely what we're going to feel. So if you've ever done a static stretch and you get that discomfort at the end of the stretch, that is that distribution of tension through the connective tissues that of course we're going to sense. So again, that's what we're talking about. When we talk about tight, we're talking about a sensation. So not necessarily a useful representation as far as decision making is concerned until we identify joint position, muscle position, etc., and then we can determine what an intervention is. So this is a common mistake where people will say, "Oh, you feel tight, you need to stretch." When the reality is, it's like that tissue is already under tension under some circumstances, especially if I've got an eccentrically oriented muscle and a yielding action. It's like all you're trying to do is like you just pull on something even harder than it's already getting pulled on, and it's already in an eccentrically oriented position. It just becomes an exercise in futility, when the reality is what we need to do under those circumstances is just restore the full excursion of movement under those circumstances, and then we feel nothing, because under situations where we have full concentric to eccentric orientation of muscles, which would be representative of full breathing excursion or full joint motion, however you want to perceive this, we feel nothing. The reason that there's such difficulty here is because when we're at this end game narrow situation, we have a tremendous amount of concentric orientation that limits the hip mobility to such a degree that it's almost like we really don't have anything available to work with in regards to positioning. And so everything looks like it becomes a compensatory strategy. And so let me show you what we're talking about. We'll grab the pelvis here. So we'll start with our narrow ISA presentation, which is going to look something like that. And remember, classic model, not perfect, but it'll give us a representation. So we're kind of starting there. We get a lot of concentric orientation in this posterior lower aspect to such a degree that it creates this push from behind, and it sort of orients this ischial tuberosity in line with the femur. And so these external rotation muscles actually start to pull the femur back inward. So it's not just ER. You end up with this presentation that looks like they're externally rotated but adducted at the hip. And so when we talk about common findings, these are the people with the really, really horrible looking toe touches. And so, they're the people that if they can get below their knees, they're pretty happy. So we have extreme deficits in that. Hip abduction is very, very limited. So it's often 10, 20 degrees of hip abduction. Straight leg raise is very limited. Many times we can throw some manual therapies at this and reduce some of that concentric orientation. Maybe that buys us a little bit of hip mobility that we can work with. But if we're going to rely on exercise, sometimes we can maybe put them into a prone situation and do something like that. That will give us some of this eccentric orientation that we need in that posterior lower, but it tends to be a challenge. It's almost an exercise in futility in many cases. A lot of times, what we have to actually do, if we have to start with some form of hip approximation activity, and so What we're talking about is creating a situation in the back of the pelvis that looks something like this. And so what we're doing is actually we're inducing a very, very small amount of rotation through the pelvis through hip approximation. And so an activity will look something like that you're seeing on screen right now. And what this starts to do is it starts to actually increase the amount of eccentric orientation in this reciprocal fashion. So we're creating almost like a really tiny variation of the gait cycle through this hip approximation. In many cases, we get really good results from this, and we actually pick up enough hip flexion that we can now start to move people towards some activities like maybe we do some hook lying. We continue to work on yielding and overcoming strategies in this hook lying position, or we can move them into a sideline propulsive activity with an increasing degree of hip flexion, and we can superimpose some reaching on top of that. So you got to remember that you've got this iteration that's going on in the thorax at the same time. So if we can superimpose some reaching on top of this propulsive strategy, we get a much bigger bang. One of the activities that's kind of off the beaten path is actually this army crawling that we might want to do. So when we think about the posterior lower compressive strategy, that's going to limit the degree of hip flexion in the traditional imaginary sagittal plane. What we can do though is we can deviate the knee laterally, and we can go get some extra rotation in that position. So that can actually help us increase the amount of eccentric orientation in this posterior lower strategy as well. So it's probably considered a developmental position for some of you, depending on what your background is, but we want to turn this into an army crawl. This is also a great one for kids with this scenario, because they like to crawl around and pretend to be animals. So a little FYI there. If we move to a standing position, what we probably want to do, because we don't have a lot of hip excursion to start with, we're going to start with a very narrow stance chopping activity with a little bit of weight shift. And again, that's going to help us start to capture this little bit of rotation. And again, we're going to sort of move them through a gait cycle. We're going to go from one chop to the other in a reciprocal fashion to recapture this eccentric orientation. Once we start to gain some hip abduction, we gain a little bit of hip rotation back. Now we can move to a bit of a staggered stance chopping activity, and then we can move into like a high-low cable press. One of the things that I like to do at this point is I'll just call it sneaky arm training. So we'll actually have them do biceps and triceps activities, if you will. But what we're going to do is going to be very particular about what stance they're performing these in. And so again, we get to reinforce what we're chasing with this concentric eccentric orientation in the posterior lower aspect, while they get to do fun stuff, if you will. As you start to gain hip motion, obviously now we can move into split stance activities. And ultimately what we want to be able to do is move into a deeper side split stance. And this would be indicative of the fact that we've got plenty of eccentric orientation at this point. And then eventually what you may want to be able to do then is move to some form of toe touching, some kind of progression in that manner. And then ultimately that might be what you use as a maintenance strategy. So again, this is a really, really difficult scenario because of the degree of concentric orientation and the compressive strategy that goes on. Take your time, be patient. You have to be very, very patient in these scenarios. But again, work with what you have, work within the constraints, don't force, don't drive compensatory strategies too hard, because it just becomes a point of frustration.